This is Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs, editor of Tradition. Here we are, days before the arrival of Passover. If we're not drowning in cleaning products, chances are we're doing the important, perhaps more important work of reflecting on the Exodus story in advance of Seder night. A highlight of this week's observances is the recounting of the biblical 10 plagues. In an interesting new book, Dr. Jeremy Brown considers the 11th plague, a kind of catch-all phrase he uses to explore how Jews as a people and Judaism as a religious community and tradition have encountered and responded to plagues, disease, and pandemics from the Bible right up to our own days of COVID-19. Dr. Jeremy Brown is the director of the Office of Emergency Care Research at the National Institutes of Health. He's a physician and a historian of science and medicine. In our winter 2021 issue, we featured his essay, The Plague Wedding, which was republished as a chapter in his most recent book, The 11th Plague, Jews and Pandemics from the Bible to COVID-19, from Oxford University Press. The Tradition podcast recently caught up with Brown to talk about his work, traditional Jewish responses to plague and disease, and more generally, his assessment of how Jewish thought and halachic tradition have responded over time to such occurrences, and how we fared during the most recent pandemic. Jeremy considers the long arc of history, and does so through the prisms of theology, halakha, ritual, and folk custom, some admittedly bizarre, including the so-called Schwarze Chasana, or plague wedding, about which he wrote in our pages, an article you can find in the archives of traditiononline.org. He balances this with the insights and wisdom drawn from history, epidemiology, medical science, sociology, public policy, and more. Dr. Jeremy Brown, welcome to the Tradition podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
In our winter 2021 issue, Tradition published your essay, The Plague Wedding, which tells a very, very bizarre story, which we're going to get into momentarily, but we were delighted to see that chapter was included with lots of other material in this very, very heavy book. You get a good workout just picking it up. The 11th Plague, Jews and Pandemics from the Bible to COVID-19. So first of all, just tell us the meaning of this title. What is the 10 plagues we know? It's the season that we're in right now. What's the 11th plague?
So the 11th plague in the book is really a stand-in for the multitude of pandemics that have faced the Jewish people and shaped our culture and our liturgy and our tefillot, and shaped that followed the 10 plagues. So I use it as a sort of a placeholder, whether that be bubonic plague in the book of Shmuel, whether that be bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, whether that be cholera that decimated the Jewish communities along with the rest of the population in Eastern Europe, whether that 11th plague be smallpox and the amazing story of the early Jewish acceptance of the new smallpox vaccine, and indeed up to this day, where the 11th plague that we faced was COVID.
With COVID. So since we are talking about plagues, and since our listeners are with us now on the eve of Passover, and we'll all be spilling out a drop of wine with the recitation of each of the 10 plagues as a way of recognizing that even when these traumas are visited on our enemies, we don't celebrate and rejoice. We're mindful of the suffering of all people, but nevertheless, with some historical distance between us and those biblical events, your first chapter opens with a bit of whimsy. A little bit of gloating might be permitted, you write. It's now possible to buy 10 plagues, finger puppets, endless fun for kids and family. 10 plagues, nail decals. Why is this manicure different from all other manicures? But in reality, when we get up close to such traumas, or when the traumas get close to us, as they did 3 years ago, we were all in lockdown. You in North America, we here in Israel, and the world over. And we can remember just 3 short years ago that first COVID Pesach, where the elderly widows, widowers, other people that were alone had Passover, sometimes for the first time in 80, 90 years, celebrated the holiday all by themselves. What bigger plague could we imagine than, of course, all of the suffering and the loneliness and the economic upheaval and all the things that COVID visited upon us during these past 3 years. And when you get up close to it, when it affects you, it's a little harder to be quite so whimsical about it. But take us back. The first biblical set of plagues, of course, are the 10 that were visited upon the Egyptians, and you use this as a way to get into the conversation of what you're doing and trying to unpack the theology and the history and the contemporary science that is sometimes used both by people that are within the tradition and people that stand outside of religious tradition to understand different historical records that are brought about. And it's part of the interesting thing that you do in this book. And if I can commend to our readers some of your other books that you wrote a few years ago. You wrote a book about the 1918 pandemic, and that may have been just a year before people were ready to start thinking about pandemics. And then your excellent book about Jewish, what's the right word? Cosmography.
Jewish responses to Copernicus.
Jewish responses to Copernicus. This way that you kind of tie together in all of your writing, all of these very, very disparate fields, science and religion and theology and history and etc., to help us understand something that was then, by Yamim Hohem, and also as it might have reference today. So tell us a little bit how you use the original 10 plagues to kind of get into this.
Sure. Yeah, so the original 10 plagues are, of course, the ones that with which we are all familiar, and it was after them that I made the book, The 11th Plague. But when you jump into the 10 plagues, they are only part of the story of pandemics that are in the Torah and in Tanakh in general. So Sefer Bamidbar, for example, has 4 separate recorded events that was some kind of Magefa, or in one instance, the Torah describes it as a Makkah. This occurs actually in the 11th chapter when the Jewish people are complaining that they remembered the fish and the cucumbers and the melons that were offered to them that they could eat in England. Yeah, all the tasty treats. And that was definitely the wrong thing to do. Habasa odenu bein sheneihem. The food was still unchewed in their teeth, and God sends a plague. Makkah Rabba Ma'od, a very severe plague. Now, it's very interesting that in this example, the word Makkah is used, and not the slightly more common word Magefa, which describes the other 3 plagues in the book of Bamidbar. And Makkah, of course, is the way that Kodesh Baruch Hu reminds us of what he did. Hiketi kol bachor be'eretz Mitzrayim. I smote every firstborn. And here, in a very clever way, by using the word Makkah, when the Jewish people are complaining and being whimsical about their time in Egypt, Torah is telling us that they were then reprimanded in an extremely severe way, for certain, that they lusted after the food in Egypt, and so they were smitten with some form of death, a Makkah, just as the Egyptians were. But there are 3 other examples in Sefer Bamidbar. We have the Magefa that followed the spies in Parashat Shalach. We have the Magefa that occurred after the rebellion of Korach, and the violent Makkah that's described at the end of Balak, when Pinchas stabbed those who went whoring, and then the Torah tells us that it was that particular that particular intervention of Pinchas that ended that plague. So we have the 10 plagues, which are commonly known. I think we have the 4 plagues, which, now that I've described them, can be seen as a unit, I think. And then we have, of course, plagues in the specifically, I look at the plague in the book of Shmuel, the plague of Ashdod, which is described in great detail and takes on a fascinating history of its own in its translations during the Middle Ages. Right. So I think the 10 plagues is really a springboard for us to sort of think about how our people, how our nation really began, built out of the cauldron of plagues and pandemics. And it's precisely because of pandemics that we obtained our initial freedom as a people.
One of the things that you do in those chapters is to survey contemporary biblical or historical scholarship, again, not all of which is situated, let's say, within our Beit Midrash, that bring all types of speculative, scientific theorizing about, on the presumption that there were, in fact, waves of plagues that hit ancient Egypt, what might have caused them, what natural phenomena might have caused them, and to even so going so far as to speculate why whatever it was that turned the Nile red then led to a plague of frogs and led to a plague of et cetera, et cetera. So beyond the, just beyond your own intellectual, wide-ranging intellectual curiosity, your own, I guess full disclosure here, you and I are friends. I've been to your home. I've seen your library. I know exactly how wide-ranging your interests and your reading habits are. Beyond, your own intellectual pursuit to, know everything that's been written on the topic that interests you. What insights do we gain? We approach the biblical text principally as Dvar Hashem, the word of God. We sit at the Seder night, Ki'ilu anachnu yatzanu miMitzrayim, to relive the Exodus. We pour out those drops of wine because we're imagining that we are witness to the plagues brought by God's outstretched arm. What further insights? In what way are we more edified by turning to that bookshelf that offers these types of scientific or historical theorizing? How does that, in your own mind, in your own genesis of writing and thinking and researching, how do these things come together?
Yeah, it's a terrific question because, as you said, we have one story of these plagues that is told in the Torah, and then we have a scientific explanation that has been offered in various ways. None of them are very persuasive, or in my mind, persuasive at all. But I just want to point out that the search for a scientific explanation of the 10 plagues is actually a very frum, and one might call it a very orthodox pursuit. And the example I give in the book is that of Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, who lived in Algiers. He served as the rabbi of the city. He eventually makes his way to Yerushalayim, and he wrote a lengthy work, V'zot Yehuda, which was published a little bit after his death, published in Salzburg in 1776. And this includes a commentary on the Haggadah. And Rabbi Ayash asked, why was it necessary during the plague of Dever for the Torah to tell us that the livestock was smitten in the fields? The pasuk said, Hinei yad Hashem hoya b'miknacha asher b'sadeh. We know that animals live out in the fields. What reason was there for the Torah to tell us that they were in the fields? And Rabbi Ayash here reminds us that for many centuries
where else would the cattle be?
No. But yes, correct. Where else would the cattle be? But he reminds us that looking for a scientific explanation using the best theories of the day is really a very Jewish pursuit. And if I could just share this with you, what Rabbi Ayash suggests is that the plagues were caused to a large degree by foul air, or what later became called miasmas. And miasmas was the theory of what causes what we call today infectious disease. And it was the reigning theory for many centuries. You can find stories of its reference and alluded to in the Gemara. And basically all until modern germ theory in the 19th century, it was thought that miasmas, poisonous gases that come up from the fields and the streams, that is the cause of illness. And what Rabbi Ayash points out in his commentary is that because that's how plagues happen, the Torah specifically tells us when you're standing in a fresh field far away from any of the poisonous miasmas, you're really outside on the farm, you would expect that there would be no deaths because you were far away from the poisonous miasmas. And that, Rabbi Ayash says, that is the reason that the Torah goes out of its way to tell us that the cattle was in the field, to show you that despite the fact that they were in the field, far away from the source of the plague, the miasma, they were still smitten.
The cause can't be misascribed to something natural. It can only be understood as the hand of God striking them down.
Right. Now, of course, this strikes us today as rather outdated. While there is some role of miasmas and environmental pollution, we might call it today, but we know that infectious diseases are not caused by steam and mist rising from volcanoes and so on. But this really gives you an insight, I think, that looking for scientific explanations using the best science of the day to understand the Psukim in the Torah, to understand the 10 plagues, to understand the Haggadah, this is really something that is part and parcel of our Jewish heritage. Briefly, there are a number of theories about those 10 plagues. Greta Hort in 1957 suggested that it all began, as you said, with silt that washed into the Nile, and that causes it to become overrun with bacteria, and then the frogs hop out, and so on and so on and so on. And later there is a mosquito infection which spreads anthrax, and the cattle die off from anthrax. But what's interesting, she stops after the sixth plague. She herself in her theorizing says that the last 4 plagues were not interconnected. She just couldn't make that connection. There are other theories that it wasn't anthrax, but it was a tiny little parasite called Trypanosoma evans. It's the cause of a disease called Sura in animals. There's beetles that may have caused it. The one that particularly interested me in our modern times is the suggestion that climate change was the cause of all of these plagues, beginning with the El Nino effect in the Eastern Pacific Ocean, which warms the Mediterranean, and then you get algae blooms in the Nile, and so on and so on. A pair of British volcanologists and archaeologists in the 1940s suggested that there was a volcanic eruption in Central Africa, which led to and one can go on and on. There is no end to some of this theorizing. As I said, I have read nearly all of them, I imagine, and really none of them are persuasive at all. I think they really don't add up. Some people in the middle just give up and say, yeah, and I don't know how the last 4 were connected, but even some of the other supposed connections are very, very tenuous at best.
In your introduction, you mentioned that this was actually a project you had undertaken before COVID arrived, and then COVID hastened and focused all of our attention on these topics. But you admit that when you began, you did so with no hypothesis to test. You simply let the sources speak for themselves, and any conclusions came later. And then you write, what I uncovered, much to my surprise, was the profoundly deep way in which pandemics have impacted the story of Jews and Judaism. So you set out to kind of tell the story, and of course, chronologically, you begin with the biblical accounts we've been discussing, but then you take us all the way up to the most contemporary present day, and along the way, we see cholera in the 19th century, and before that, we see smallpox in the 18th century, and you name it. There's no end to different plagues that have been visited, of course, not just upon Jews, but upon society at large throughout the world, including the areas in which the Jewish people were dispersed. And when this happens, there's this kind of curious double-edged effect. There's a kind of internal reaction and an external reaction, or perhaps domestic and foreign reactions to what's going on from the Jewish perspective. On the first hand, I think you remind us of the Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit, which deals at great length with what's the appropriate Jewish spiritual, religious, theological response to calamities of this sort. It should be one of prayer, it should be one of fasting, it should be one of searching to both alleviate the suffering of those around us, but also to kind of questioning our ways in order to make things right with God in heaven, because we're interpreting these experiences as some form of divine punishment. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of eye that's open to what's happening in the big world around us, because we're mindful of the fact, and history plays this out, that very often the Jewish people were scapegoated by the non-Jewish host societies in which we found ourselves, that we were the cause of the plague that was being visited on the village or the country or the world. And these kind of lead to two very different responses. One is a kind of internal cheshbon hanefesh, stock taking, and the other is a very, very defensive posture insofar as the world is concerned. And you treat both of these in two different sections of the book. So lead us through a bit, or maybe give us some of the highlights of each of those areas.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure if I would call it defensive posturing, but there's certainly needed.
Well, it's defensive insofar as if a pogrom, if the plague results in a pogrom in which our neighbors are pressing us, we have to adopt a defensive.
We have to adopt. One of the parts of the book that I'm particularly proud of is the section that I deal with the theology of pandemics. I think it was something that during COVID we really failed to see from our rabbinic thought leaders. Certainly in the modern Orthodox world, there was very little, although there was some response. In the conservative and reform world, there was almost no theological response. And amongst the Haredim, the theological response was always, this shows that God controls every last thing to every blade of grass, and who is man to be so haughty? This is the lesson, and we have to daven with more kavanah. None of these responses are, in my understanding, keeping with Talmudic thought on the question. The Gemara simply says that when a plague is unleashed, there is no difference between sinners and saints. Now, you may say, but that means that people die who didn't deserve it. And the answer is yes. That is exactly what the Gemara means. People sometimes die when they don't deserve it during a pandemic, because we see this with our own eyes. You can't suggest that everybody who died in a pandemic was deserving of it, and everybody who lived was somehow a great tzaddik. So this, what I call the pandemic theology, is something that I really wanted to see, and I hadn't seen it discussed very much at all, really. So, Rav Yosef, who's the author of this saying, who's obviously a Babylonian who lived around 320, died around 320. He says, once permission is given to the destroyer to kill, he does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Now, this, I think, is a very, at once, both very troubling theologically, because God controls everything, including the blade of grass that is growing. On the other hand, it's very liberating theologically, because you don't have to bend yourself into a pretzel to try and explain
to justify
why
God's way, how the righteous perished and the wicked was spared.
Now, to be sure and to be fair, this is Rav Yosef's opinion, and it's not the opinion of what one might call mainstream Talmudic thinking, in which God is tightly in control of everything. But it does allow us, I think, a glimpse into very important Amora's insights as to, yes, there are sometimes the good die young for no reason other than it's a natural thing. So I do pay some attention to the theology. I also point out how I think our theological responses changed when you compare COVID to what happened with the outbreak of the HIV epidemic. And you can see amongst writing, predominantly, specifically amongst English writers in what we might call in the modern Orthodox camp, who mostly blamed the victim for HIV, saying words to the effect of, well, you undertake any kind of homosexual behavior, this is kind of what happens. It's just a natural thing. You shouldn't have been doing that. That was, I'm perhaps doing it a little injustice, but that was by and large the response. And I found that those same writers, those of course who were still alive for COVID, those same writers never suggested that during the COVID outbreak. They never suggested, well, if you sin, this is the natural response. In fact, they mostly ignored it completely. People who had written during the HIV epidemic of its theological implications stuck strictly to the halachic implications of COVID. Should you be saying Tachnun during Nissan? We've got Rosh Chodesh, as we record this is a few days away. Should you be saying Tachnun because we normally don't say it during this month, but it's a terrible month if you remember back to those first few months of COVID and that fast Pesach. So we had a deep halachic response, but we did not see, and I think this is a real shame, we did not see any kind of theological response, other than as I said, amongst the ultra-Orthodox whose response was, we have to do tshuva, we have to daven harder, and so on. And so that's one big change. So that's sort of the internal discussion that we have, and it's an ongoing discussion. And as I say, it's not just the Orthodox who fail to discuss this. You would think that amongst the conservative and reform movements, there would be a discussion of the theological implications of God's hand in a world that just seems so unjust. People were surely asking about this. And yet those movements too failed, as far as I can tell, to respond with any kind of theological discussion. There was a book published which does it, which was a very interesting book on modern responses to pandemics. And that small book did contain some of this theological discussion, but
not enough to your taste, you're saying.
Not enough to my taste, and I think not enough to the taste of the people of Amcha, right? Not enough to the people who sit down and think about these things. Now, without sounding glib, there are people who don't think about these things. They go about life not really concerned about why the good die young or why the innocent seem to suffer. And perhaps, as they say in the book, perhaps the over-examined life is really not is much harder to live or not worth living.
Well, particularly while you are going through an experience.
While you're going through it.
But historically speaking, of course, there were theological responses to worldwide suffering. But beyond that, part of the Jewish response, beyond the philosophical, theological, was a whole variety of practices, folk practices, superstitious practices, and all types of other things that entered to one degree or another, sometimes remaining on the periphery, Jewish life in different parts of the Gola, different sgulot, lucky charms, as it were, to ward off things which we modern rationalists, we men and women of science, tend to look at with something of a jaundiced eye. But among the most bizarre responses to pandemics in the Jewish experience is one that you documented in Tradition's Winter 2021 issue, which is available in our archives at traditiononline.org, of the plague wedding, the so-called Schwarze Chasana, the black wedding, which seems like something out of early modern or medieval Yiddish literature, and as you document, appears in early modern Yiddish and early Hebrew literature. But in fact, in the month that COVID begins, in March 2020, in the Ponovich Cemetery in Bnei Brak, one of these bizarre ceremonies is conducted and was widely reported on, from the blogosphere to the New York Times and everything in between. So first of all, just tell us, for those that may be unfamiliar, what is the so-called plague wedding, and how do you use it as a lens to understand something about Jewish response to pandemics?
In many ways, this plague wedding is what one would call a sui generis, right? That it's really a sort of a bria bifnei atzmo. It's very hard to link this to other stuff that Jews do in response to pandemics, but it is a very important part of the story. Let me preface this by saying that in a survey done at Asafa Rofer Hospital about the use of talisman in a pediatric intensive care unit, they found that 30% of the families whose children were in the pediatric ICU had either put a Rebbe picture in or tied a red string around the incubator or done something that one would call using a segula. 30% in Asafa Rofer, and this was done in the early 2000s. So we still like to use these objects. And by the way, that was regardless, they found the finding was regardless of the person's level of religious observance or socioeconomic status.
Well, although we might put an asterisk there, Jeremy, as someone who has spent time in neonatal ICUs, and I consider myself a fairly rationalist Litvak, like there being no atheist in a foxhole. There is no parent in a neonatal intensive care, very few parents in neonatal intensive care who won't reach out for even the most outlandish ray of hope. So there are all types of sociological ways to understand this.
Yes, but and you're right, of course, that these are people whose children are desperately ill. But it is interesting, I think, that a third of them would use these interventions. In any event, I had started researching the plague wedding, as it's most commonly called. Actually, when I came across it as I was doing my research for the book on the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918.
But never imagining that this would resurface in contemporary Jewish life.
I'd never heard of it. I'd never heard of it before my research about 5 years ago. I was completely ignorant of it. And then you sort of start digging around, and I spent a long time on this. As you mentioned, it eventually became an article that I published in Tradition. And you start digging around, and then I've written much of the essay before COVID began, and then all of a sudden, there's this plague wedding that, as you mentioned, that took place in the Ponevezh cemetery in Bnei Brak. It's actually footage is captured by a drone, so you can have that.
There's a link to it from within the article,
right? And then you have this in the corner of a cemetery, under a black canopy, a black chuppah, with the few onlookers that there were, literally standing beside fresh graves. This very young couple is married. And in fact, I'd originally written the essay, and I had tracked down what I thought was the last recorded Schwarze Chasna, or plague wedding, anywhere. It took place during the occupation of Zeklovich in 1942. And I had written that this is the last recorded plague wedding, but it's not. The one that happened
80 years later, it comes back.
So what is this?
The ceremony is what we take. Often it's a yatom and a yatomah, two orphan children.
We take basically people who one might call the Nebuch cases of the community, and they probably refer to them like that in Yiddish when these things were undertaken fairly frequently, as they were. You take somebody, an orphan, somebody we might call now physically challenged, handicapped. In some of the early Yiddish literature, these words are translated as crippled. We don't use that word anymore. But you take somebody who otherwise would have had a very hard time finding a shidduch, and the community would raise funds. It would march them down to the outskirts of the cemetery, where they were not coerced into this by any means, where there would be a ceremony. They would get married, kadas or kadin. They were generally followed by a large celebration in which both the local Jews and often the local non-Jewish populations participated. And this was not uncommon. In fact, when I published the book,
it was specifically done as a way of warding off the plague.
As a way of either ending an existing pandemic, that was often very, very common, or to protect the town against one that was sort of encroaching and creeping, certainly during the great cholera epidemics of the 19th century. This was when it was done, but this wasn't rare. And this is what really struck me that in my book, I have an appendix of at least 20 examples of where a plague wedding is recorded in the memorial books, the Yiddish memorial books that were published in Israel in the 50s and 60s. And there are first-hand accounts of this. I also discovered a children's cartoon book that is delightfully illustrated, which has the story of a plague wedding. And like you would sit down, this kind of thing, like a Sesame Street book. It's a delightful story. It's beautifully illustrated. But at its core,
as you said, fun for the whole family.
Fun for the whole. At its core, it's a story about a rabbi who's trying to head off a plague. So he invites people, he makes a plague wedding, and the town is saved from the cholera epidemic that threatened it. So from something that I didn't know about, and I imagine many people had not heard about, to a cartoon book that is available on the topic, was a big, a long way to travel, but it was something that was very enlightening. I mean, the fact that, for example, they were generally scenes of great frivolity is almost uncannily representative of them. They were very rarely somber occasions. There's one or two that were somber occasions, but by and large, it was drink. There was frolicking. There were jesters, and there were people
like any other Eastern European Jewish wedding.
What we might call today shtick. There was shtick at these weddings, and it's just remarkable to see. People were not happy with it. There are recorded incidents of the leaders of certain communities being very unhappy about this. Of course, the members of the Haskalah, when they heard about these and saw how often they were practiced,
for either critique or satire.
Yes, very, very upset about it. You pointed me to Agnon's book on a short story about
in Shalom Aleichem, in Agnon, and in other writers that are documenting that time and that place. It makes appearances as part of the cultural realities of the
and when we try to understand the what is this all? What are the profound? Where does this come from? It's actually very, very hard. So Sefer HaTamim has some vague reasons, but the best that I can come up with is that in somehow this was a way of saying to God, look, we're marrying off the Nebuch people in our community, right? These elderly people, these people who have diseases that or physical handicaps that don't enable them to get married, or very poor. With these orphans, this is what we're doing for our most threatened population. Why don't you, God, do the same for all of us? That's, I think, the closest explanation.
In the Kabbalistic notion of the theurgic, that our actions here can force God's hand above. The fact that you were working on this piece of research, and then in the most unlikely way, it comes back into the contemporary realities of Jewish life, no matter how marginal it may have been, was certainly just one of those curious facts of how when you start looking at something, it tends to pop up at you.
No, I really would recommend that for those of you who have not seen this, you look at the link in the article, or just Google plague wedding, 2020 or something like that. You will find the clip.
And in your survey of Jewish responses, from, as we discussed earlier, the theological, philosophical, to bolstering acts of charity and kindness and simple support for those that are suffering, to the more outlandish, this is certainly on the furthest extreme. It was a chapter again that appeared in Tradition and is collected here as the 7th chapter of the 11th Plague. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that you are sitting in your office at the National Institute of Health, in or near the nation's capital, where you work as a physician and a scientist. And earlier in our conversation, you made a critique of what you see as the kind of failure of Jewish theological response during COVID. But how do we do on the science? As a religious community, looking back over the past 3 years, how do you feel that the Jewish community, the Orthodox community, did in terms of working with the science, which of course is something that's you fellows and your scientific method are very well known, that it's less significant how much we get it right exactly right now. It's our commitment to getting it right moving forward, and
Yes, to
to
being
learning as we
less
go
wrong.
along. So, this question of faith and reason, of Torah and science, or Torah umada, or choose your slogan. This is something we discuss, in many different contexts. Very recently here at Tradition, we've been giving a lot of attention to questions of Torah Umada and how the humanities are faring in our community. But here, Torah Umada, Mada with a capital Mem, science. How do you see the test case of COVID as a way of understanding where things stand in the relationship between those two sides of the Vavachibur, the connecting
Yes,
and
the question that you're asking, Jeff, is really you can't characterize the entire Jewish community's response as one thing or another. There were within communities very different responses. The conservative movement pivoted to online services and was very, very machmir, if you like, about staying out of places that congregate people closely. So they went all online, even those conservative shuls where generally they frown upon that kind of thing. And then you had Orthodox communities in which shuls were closed down. You had Orthodox communities in which nobody cared, and shuls were as packed as ever. And we really responded, I think, along the spectrum of the society around us. There is we did, as a community, as different communities, we did what people do. Some respond wholeheartedly to the science, and let's not forget, the vaccine was created in record time. I was interviewed at the beginning of the pandemic and predicted that a vaccine would probably take somewhere in the order of 8 to 10 years, because you know what? That's how long vaccines have taken to get produced and marketed and have all the safety studies done. And it was done in a fraction of that time. So, we had communities that embraced that. I have a chapter in the book that touches upon the Jewish anti-vaxxer movement called "The Right to Die." That's the title of the chapter, which I'm kind of proud of. The Right to Die. I go into a great detail of. I go into great detail about the Jewish anti-vaxxer movement, and to just make one very quick point along that. What I discovered, again, much to my amazement, because I went in with this not knowing deeply the literature, not knowing the difference between the poskim in Israel and the poskim in North America and elsewhere. I discovered that anti-vaxxers in that movement, there is no such thing as a Jewish anti-vaxxer. There's an anti-vaxxer who happens to be Jewish. There's an anti-vaxxer who happens to be Christian. There's an anti-vaxxer who happens to be Muslim.
Even though some of those people are advancing their ideas in the name of their religion.
Absolutely. Each one of those sections does, each one of those communities does that. But it struck me that the literature that there is on when people talk to anti-vaxxers across different societies is very similar. They generally strike the similar socioeconomic groups. They generally, again, we're making big generalizations, but generally anti-vaxxers can be found to a much greater degree in fundamentalist religious groups. So one might think that would be the ultra-Orthodox or right-wing Haredi movement. It would also be the Pentecostalists or their equivalent in the Christian movement, and certainly there are poskim amongst the Muslim community who have outlawed the COVID vaccine, and again they find support in their body of religious literature. So none of these people are really. There isn't a Christian anti-vaxxer. There's an anti-vaxxer who happens to be a devout Christian, and I think when I realized this, it actually made me feel a whole lot better, because I'm sure that many of us feel some discomfort at the behavior and at the responses to the vaccination among certain members of the community, both here and in Israel and across the world, Melbourne and in Manchester and in Miami. It didn't really matter where. But once I realized that this is not a defining feature of their Judaism, it's a defining feature of who they are as an anti-vaxxer, then it made it all rather more palatable. I don't know if that makes sense to you,
a
but
bug rather than a feature of.
Yes, and also, you can. I suspect that a from anti-vaxxer probably is going to have a lot more in common with a devout fundamentalist Christian than they may have with somebody else within their own community who doesn't share perhaps the same core fundamental beliefs. So that is a sort of a longer way of saying that, we as a community across the world, we as a people across the world, reacted in all kinds of ways, some of which I think we can all agree we should be very proud of, and some of which were actually cringeful, and one wish that they would never happen, but such is life.
Well, I think that's a good time to turn our attention back to the oncoming Passover preparations we must all be doing, and to dig out those 10 plague finger puppets, and to move away from the suffering the world experienced these past 3 years to a time where we can once again think about these things both with a bit of whimsy allowed only by distance, but also by the very serious, again, philosophical, theological, historical, scientific insights that are gleaned from reading Dr. Jeremy Brown's The 11th Plague, Jews and Pandemics from the Bible to COVID-19, freshly supplied to us from Oxford University Press, and to visit traditiononline.org, where you can sample the original edition of the chapter on the rather bizarre but fascinating nonetheless plague wedding. Dr. Jeremy Brown, thank you very much, and Chag Sameach to you and all of our listeners.
Thank you. Chag Sameach to all of the listeners. Have a happy and a kosher Pesach.
And healthy.
Amen.